Okay, we're almost here. Week 1 is in one day. We're at episode 99, by the way, of the SumerSports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff. We're excited to get you started here for Week 1, starting with Kansas City and Detroit. Here for a little intro music. Well, Thomas, we know that the NFL is the most captivating entertainment product in the entire country, maybe even in the world. And you know what? They never cease to disappoint. This entire week, we're talking about Kansas City versus Detroit. We're talking about the great offense of the Chiefs and the budding, sort of offense and team of the Detroit Lions. And yesterday, we log on to Twitter and we get reports that Travis Kelce's hyperextended his knee and is in doubt for tomorrow night against Detroit. And that, leaves Kansas City, when you think about it, three most valuable players on this team: Patrick Mahomes, Chris Jones, Travis Kelce. The defending Super Bowl champions, Thomas, could go into tomorrow night's game missing two of those players.
Think about it. I mean, what an exciting day this is, one day away. By the way, I joined your buddy today, Solomon Wilcots and James White, on their show. I know you're going to be working with them next week. Point is, I was so jacked up about talking about the game. They didn't stay there too long on the topic. But look, I'm so looking forward to talking to you about it, because I know you ooze this red stuff going on here, even though you're not supposed to admit that to all of our clients potentially. But hey, this is going to be a fun game to watch.
Well, people forget. So I was out to lunch yesterday at Chando's Tacos with our colleague Sean Clement, and I was standing in line just talking like a normal person. And somebody came up to me and said, "Are you guys going to win tomorrow?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry." And he goes, "The Chiefs." And I'm like, "Oh wait, you know me? I apparently, yes, give off this Chiefs fan vibe that apparently people I've never met before in the city of Atlanta or Buckhead know it. So I don't particularly." Hide it very well. It's funny, like Kansas City, when we talk about like the markets, they open as a 7-point home favorite. I think that that's pretty right. When I look at my numbers for the game or our numbers here at Sumer, if the environment was perfect, we would also make the game about 7. But what we've seen over time is there's been some Detroit love. It got down to 6.5 when it was not necessarily clear that Chris Jones was going to play. By the way, Chris Jones this morning was at a Ronald McDonald fundraising event in the city of Kansas City with both of his agents, the Katz brothers, and took some questions from the media. It sounds like he thinks he could play tomorrow if they signed him to a deal. I'm selling that idea. And then, of course, Travis Kelce gets hurt. Kelce, Thomas, I want your opinion on this, because you traded for another Chiefs tight end way back in the day. Mm-hmm. Who is a Hall of Famer, has all the records for tight ends, all the records that Travis Kelce is sort of going after. The weird thing is, and as somebody who played the position, I look at Kelce and I don't necessarily see him as this physical marvel. I see him as a very crafty. I see him as a very intelligent. I do worry, as a big fan of his, if he were to ever decline physically, what that would mean for him, because he's always been very, very athletic, very, very fast for a tight end, but he's not like Tony Gonzalez was. He's not like ripped. He's not big. He's not like he's kind of wiry for a tight end. And so I do get worried when he comes down with an injury, because I don't necessarily know if he has like sort of the body type to deal with it as well as some of the other great tight ends in football.
So we're going to the injury thing, but before we go there, I have to ask you something candidly. Okay. All due respect to Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell. I don't know Dan like I know Brad Holmes, excuse me. But do you really believe 7 points is the number? Are you not surprised it's not higher? Injuries aside right now, going in, do you not think it would be higher than that? You're the expert in that area.
Yeah, well, I think if this game is played in week 10 and everything that we believed about the Chiefs is true and everything we believed about Detroit is true, I do think the number is wider. But early in the season, there's just so much uncertainty. Like, I think when you look at where Detroit is strong, I think that it plays into some of the weaknesses that Kansas City has. So, for example, Brad Holmes has done a terrific job drafting Penei Sewell. His predecessor drafted their left tackle and their center, and their guards are healthy for the first time, kind of in this Dan Campbell era. So, offensive line, they're very strong, and even with Chris Jones, the Chiefs are depending upon George Karlaftis, a late first-round pick from last year, Felix Anazuke-Uzama, a first-round pick from this year, to rush the passer. Charles Omena, who is out for 6 games with a suspension. Jared Goff is one of those quarterbacks who the disparity between how good he is when pressured and how good he is when clean is bigger than any other quarterback in the league, and it has been for a long time. And so when I look at the way that the Detroit Lions match up, I think that they're going to be able to protect Jared Goff. And I think furthermore, where the Chiefs are strong defensively, which is in the secondary, where they have a lot of depth, I don't necessarily know if that comes into play as much against the Detroit Lions wide receiving core that isn't itself deep. Like, I think that's already kind of priced in. So I think on that side of the ball, the Lions do really have an advantage. And I think that they even have an advantage with Chris Jones, Thomas.
I'm just struggling to think they have an advantage anywhere, to be honest with you. I like what they're doing there. I like how they are improving. I guess I'm just one of those guys, honestly, brother, that until proven otherwise, I continue to think they are on the come, and I like that, and it's impressive to see. Just like Brad Holmes has made some comments recently, like pretty open, right? He said he believes strongly that they could win their division. That's a strong comment from a guy who's fairly humble, but his line was, we've gone through so much. And when you're a general manager and a head coach and you go through all of the ups and downs and the turmoil of trying to put a team together, and you start feeling yourself, rising through the ranks, right? And then you have the naysayers out there saying, well, they've never won a playoff game and they are getting so much more love than a team like Pittsburgh, who ended the same record, correct? If I'm not mistaken.
A season ago, they both were 9-8. Yep.
Why is Pittsburgh not getting the same kudos as Detroit is? It's great for Detroit. It's great for the fan base. Again, I used to work there, so I'm happy for them. But I'm also one of those guys, having been brought up through the Belichickian regime. We want to keep things, contained so that we don't just flail out there and everyone jumping on the bandwagon. I'm not saying that we avoid that. I am saying, like, let's take it in steps. Mm-hmm. You're one of those guys, quite honestly, Midwesty as you are, jumping on with a wagon strong, and you believe in them at a lot of levels. And I do believe in them when you talk about their O-line. Love their O-line. I love Ragnow, by the way, one of my favorite centers to play in a long time in college football. Bob Quinn, I thought, did a really good job helping build that. And of course, Brad came along and did what he did. I really like their idea of what they did offensively at staying with, bringing in 2 running backs. I don't know, Gibbs, we'll see if he was worth the pick he was worth. Yep. Right. But a strong running back situation with Ian Montgomery. Right. Mm-hmm. They're moving him around. I mean, I'm talking about Jared, right? Keep the pressure off him. Let him do his thing. They're instilling so much confidence in him, right, Eric? As a general manager, that is huge. You didn't go out and tell him, hey, we're drafting this guy and we're just going to, take the world by storm. And if you do well for us, not. That head coach, Dan Campbell said point blank, not only through the not drafting, but you're our guy and we want to grow with you. That's a big thing for him. So there's a lot of pressure on him as well, staying just on offense first.
So, one of the things last year, I was a better last year, and the markets were saying Detroit was going to only win 6.5 games. And so I went over that number because I thought it was short. To be fair, and we're not giving out gambling advice on the show. Right now, the number for Detroit in the markets is 9.5. If I were gambling, I would not bet over that. That's, to me, your point is taken, Thomas. When you shoot up 3 wins in a market 1 year to the next, that is a hard thing to do. And what we talked about last week, your last show on Monday, we talked about that. Like, my biggest concern for Detroit would be for them to have a really fun year last year, go 9-8. Everybody's happy about you. You don't make the playoffs, which I think is important. You don't make the playoffs, so you don't go to San Francisco the same way Seattle did and get waxed. No one sees you. You won. You end the season on a high note, as opposed to the 13 of the other 14 teams that make the playoffs on a low note. So I think that that's partially of it. But I also just like the way that they built stuff. So they were very weak in defense last year, especially run defense. Right. And they go out and get Jack Campbell to play linebacker. They go get Brian Branch, who's a guy that we talked about on the SumerSports show. Very good kind of inside-outside player. Not a great athlete, but a great kind of interior box defender in this sub-league that we're in right now.
A bit overrated, meaning there were people that were talking about comes from the right system, comes from a guy who's going to teach him how to play that position. Right, I'm talking about Branch for a second. We're talking about having Nick Saban cultivate those defensive backs, which he always has. I mean, Campbell, same thing. Brad took heat for drafting him as early as he did. Quite honestly, he is like the epitome of
Dan Campbell player,
right? People that they like there, and Dan and their approach. So they did they're doing what they thought was right. And we said that early on in their draft, even when they took Gibbs. I mean, I quite honestly didn't hear. I heard a lot of criticism on those three moves, right? A lot of criticism, and they know they're building. They know what they're looking for. So to Brad Holmes' credit, he'll show people, and it'll be determined, how effective they are coming in, because they're expecting those guys to start, are they not?
Yeah, and maybe you can shed some light on this, being, having sat in that chair. I think, look, this is the first time Detroit has been favored to win their own division since 1992. That was before you worked there, a long time ago. And when I look at some teams, like I look at the Eagles, right? You look at their draft, Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith. Those are two guys that if they don't contribute this year, the Eagles are still going to be pretty damn good. Why can the Eagles do that? Because they just made the Super Bowl. They have tons of cachet. Howie doesn't need to win the NFC East here to keep his job or to even grow his legacy, right? They're the Eagles, the Bills, the Chiefs, the Bengals. They're all in position where they want to win one or two Super Bowls out of the next 5. When you're a franchise, and they've said this before, when you haven't won your own division since 1993, you haven't won a playoff game since 1991, I feel like they drafted for this year, which I think long-term is not what you really want to do sometimes. But I actually don't blame them necessarily because of the futility that their franchise has had for so long. I understand that. And I think the funny part is when if you were to reorder their draft picks, let's say you were to say, you took Branch, Laporta, Gibbs, and Campbell with your first 4 picks.
Yeah.
If you reorder those, it doesn't look so bad. And I know that's not a great argument for taking Gibbs and Campbell. I'm just saying, vis-a-vis this year, I think that they built well enough to win, especially in an NFC. And I know you brought up Pittsburgh. I think the reason, obviously, that Detroit has better expectations than Pittsburgh is just because the conference is easier, right?
So yes. Now let me backtrack here for a minute, because this is really important. The 4 players that you just mentioned, hands down, they are good football players, right? So, you could argue in a grading scale whether they're a 6.5 or a 7.5. Remember, again, the 6s being the goods, the 7 being the very goods, and the 8 being the excellents. That's a good crew of football players. In New England, when we were there, people used to take shots at us because we never had the flashy, explosive athletes as much as other teams did, right? But Bill Belichick, marvelous as he is and incredibly intelligent as he is with his team, he knew what he wanted in the positions and the specifics that he wanted. These guys represent Dan Campbell, Brad Holmes, who it's taken on, whether he's involved or not, Chris Spielman and the Fords and what they want to do, with building that franchise. I think they're doing what they think is right for the franchise. You can never hold that over them. Again, we all know in the next 3 or 4 years, that's when you'll determine the success of these players, whether they're good, whether they were very good, or whether they were, more mediocre or adequate. What I will say, and I want to do my little prop in here, kudos to the Lions as well. Early on when we were talking about this, I said, it is imperative that you let Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell do their thing as head coach and general manager, or GM and head coach, right? Because there were other people. When you have a president and you have Chris Spielman coming in, you have, Mrs. Ford, and then, you have Mike Disner, who's a salary cap guy, and they're all trying to put their hands in it, trying to get the guys where they are so that they can hit the ground running. Let them run, let them do their thing. And to that organization, good on them that they're letting these two run the football organization, because they are showing. I mean, they both have unbelievable confidence, and I love seeing it. So what I am saying is, I'm for you. Let's just not blow it out of the water too far ahead of the game. That's my thought.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, I'm somebody who, when you look at the NFC, I think it's very definitive that the Dallases and the Philadelphias and the San Francisco right now are in a class that's different than the Detroit Lions. But I think when you think about that second tier in the NFC, it's Seattle, another team that is brought in and rebuild and, kind of on the fly more than the Detroit Lions, because they, Seattle never bottomed out with 3 wins or anything. And then you have, I think Detroit is kind of in that second tier as well that could go either way. And we're going to talk a little bit about Green Bay, Chicago in a second, because that's my favorite game of the weekend. But I think good on Detroit for looking at the landscape of the division and saying, we could try to do it again. We should try to keep being competitive and keep eking out 7-8 wins. Instead, they kind of tore the Band-Aid off. They got they got their cap in order. They built both of their lines, obviously with Hutchinson and the offensive line you were talking about. They got a quarterback in here who I think both of us know is very limited, but is good when you put the surroundings around him. And in 2 years, it's been a remarkable climb. I agree with you, though. I think you got to be careful about extrapolating too far and making them truly an elite team, even though I'd love to see that happen.
Great points. As I was doing some more research on this, and I know you have as well, on the year going into the season here, this first round of games, and you start thinking about, the question was posed to me recently about the trends, right? You have some idea about trends. I have idea about the trends that are interesting to me. One of the things that came to my mind was, okay, so you have Goff and you have Mahomes, both established quarterbacks, right? But both play into the idea of some of the trends, and they're not new. RPOs aren't new. A great amount of movement and within the offenses and creativity, I think, is not new. It's just how they're going to be using them. Our good friend Sean Syed had mentioned in his article recently and on the podcast, our podcast, about the too high, right? And how important the too high are, and how offenses are trying to violate the too high safety situation, right? Mm-hmm. But one of the things that continues to come to my mind, it used to drive me crazy when we would have the wrong personnel in the game on defense, right? Or offensively, we wouldn't capitalize on the wrong people on the personnel on. So yep. This is what I'm referring to here is I'm talking about playing with 3 tight ends, so 13 personnel, and how they're not just running with 13 personnel. And your best buddy there, Mahomes, the most throws out of 13 personnel and doing great things, and they're throwing out of it. So they get defense thinking that it's going to be run oriented, and they can throw off of that out of that personnel, which I think is really, really important. And I think what I'm saying about these trends is there are how many new quarterbacks out there that are going to have to prove themselves, or GMs who are in crossroad positions that will push their people to be smart about motion, RPO, and what I'm talking about right now. And that's, utilizing big people in situations that is not necessarily expected. Well,
the Chiefs won a Super Bowl throwing out of those heavy formations, being efficient out of those heavy formations. People forget, so the guy that's probably going to replace Kelce tomorrow, Noah Gray, a 5th-round pick in 2021 out of Duke, was 5th on the team in catches. Noah Gray, none of us, ever heard of him. Now, you're hiding this. You're not hiding this, but some people might forget that you were the general manager of a Super Bowl team that was not only very frequently throwing out of heavy personnel, but like we're setting records for efficiency and yards per attempt. Your 2016 Falcons out of 22 personnel, Levine Toilolo and Austin Hooper, and I forget who your fullback was that year. Thomas, realizing I'm a little tired today, I forget a player on his team. And then those running backs you had, like you guys saw it, right? When you have a great team, and again, I'm not saying Detroit's great, but when you have a team that can get ahead of other teams, when you have a team that has those and you can zig when others zag. And there's so like it's what you want. I remember you guys against the Seahawks in the playoffs that year, 2016, and it was a bloodbath because you got that poor third linebacker for the Seahawks who had never played 25% of snaps because everybody's nickel now. You get this poor schmuck on the field, and now he's one-on-one with Tevin Coleman. Or he's one-on-one with Taylor Gabriel, whoever your wide. You had Eric Weems, I think, was your wide receiver in 22 personnel a lot, and it's just conflict, right? And I think with Kansas City, it's the same thing. It's like they ran a lot of 13, Noah Gray and Jody Fortson, who unfortunately this year is on an injured reserve. You just get players who are not used to playing a lot on the field, and you can match up. Like I call it the defense's fullback. If you can get the defense's fullback on the field and get him matched up against one of your skill guys, you're going to win. And I think that's a great point that you just made.
What do you do? Let's go back to this because I'm really curious. As Kansas City's defense, how do you keep this sort of budding Detroit Lion offense that's moving around? Amon-Ra, your buddy, you love seeing him. What does he catch? Most of his balls are caught under 9 yards or whatever the number is. What do you do? How do you approach that? I'm not asking you as a scheme expert. I'm just saying personnel related and scheme related, as you might know. What would you do?
Well, I think without Chris Jones, you really have to, I call it two fatties in a blitz, which I know maybe is not necessarily as semantically responsible, but look, the Chiefs don't have a great 3-tech anymore. So I think what you have to do, and Chris Jones missed some of their Super Bowl year in 19, and this is kind of what they did. You have some good linebackers. I think you play a lot of 3-3-5 nickel. I think you play a lot of 4-3-5 or 4-3-4 base. I think you make both of your interior linemen on defense. I think you put nose tackle type players there, and I think you blitz. Because, again, I think Jared Goff's great, but you want to pressure Jared Goff. And I don't think they can pressure Jared Goff with just 4 against that offensive line. And I also think that if you give up a 70-yard touchdown, it doesn't hurt you as much as if literally any other team gives up a 70-yard touchdown because your quarterback's coming right back, right? And he's a great player. So to me, the strategy defensively in this game should be to force a turnover or 2 and a sack or 3, right? Yeah. And if you can do that, because a sack's worth 2 points to a defense, a turnover's worth a lot more sometimes. Your goal should not be to hold Detroit to 3 and out. You just can't. You're not that good. Your goal should be to force Jared Goff to make 2 or 3 mistakes, and then you pay your quarterback $46 million a year to score on every drive. So that's, to me, how I think you'd be aggressive. I think if they put big plays on you, that's okay. But I think you have to blitz, and I think you have to put big men on the defensive line, not to rush the passer, but to protect against the run game.
We've talked a number of different times throughout the year since we've been doing this about the GMs on both teams and the head coaches on both teams. And quite a few out there on other teams, and some you're impressed with, others you aren't. I won't mention the ones you aren't impressed with because that wouldn't be good for our business. Just from a, purely when I've read some of your documentation over the years and your opinions, because you have strong and interestingly well-documented opinions on some of the team builders. Can we talk a little bit about the team building here since we're going into a really important first game?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, which one do you want to start on, Chiefs or Detroit?
I want to go to the Chiefs because I think it's again, here we are with the Chiefs. They've done unbelievable things. They've built something that is very, very special. I've said this time and again, Brett Veach has his talent within his talent. And we know what his talent is, right? What he's really, really good at. He's got a really good eye. He's a rising star, if not a star already in the risen spot in the top 5 of the league. You could have naysayers out there throwing darts at him saying, yeah, but that's because he's got the trifecta. He's got one of the very best owners in Clark Hunt. He's got one of the very best quarterbacks in Patrick Mahomes, and one of the very best coaches, if not the best coach, in Andy Reid at this point in his career. Where I think his genius is, that's not easy as a general manager, to take your ego and navigate through something like that. Usually a general manager has a stronghold on an organization one way or another. So as positive as it is, and everyone wishes they had those three, it's not easy. And to his credit, I think he's navigated it so well. I was in the building about a year and a half, not even a year and a half ago. I don't know how long ago it was. And I remember Andy Reid saying to me, so proud of Brett Veach and what he's done. And he grew, he saw him growing as basically a young person in the business. And he's got such great respect. That is huge. And I would say to any owner, don't listen to the nonsense out there by some people who suggest you have to be at loggerheads between your GM and your head coach because debate is great. Debate is good, Eric. Debate is only good when it's highly respectful in my mind.
Yeah. Let me give you a story from the not so distant Chiefs past, because I think it's instructive. You know, back when your former colleague and your friend Scott Pioli was the GM, you know, Todd Haley took the Chiefs to 10-6 in the division title with Matt Castle as the quarterback. Matt Castle, for 1 year, had 27 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. I mean, let's put the cards on the table. A very Jared Goff kind of talent, maybe less talent than Goff, but a very like Jared Goff production type year, you know, pop-up year. The coordinators for that team you are familiar with because you're from the Patriot paradigm is Charlie Weiss and Romeo Crennel. Charlie Weiss did a fantastic job with Matt Castle. And yet Todd Haley let Charlie Weiss go in large part because he couldn't handle the fact that he was supposed to be the offensive genius, and Charlie Weiss had upstaged him a tad, right? And when you take a step back and you're like, well, we're all winning here. That's not necessarily how it goes. And so you take it over to Kansas City, right? And I know we talked about this on a show where people will give Veach his shine because he was the one who banged the table for Patrick Mahomes. But even then, he wasn't the one that drafted him. 2018 draft, 2019 draft were not necessarily a crop of bountiful fruit as far as the drafts are concerned. You have Andy Reid, who's always getting Hall of Fame, love because he deserves it. You have Patrick Mahomes, who many people are talking about as the best player of all time, however deserved this far into his career. You also have Eric Bieniemy, everybody talking about him as a head coach candidate, X, Y, and Z. To navigate that situation with the humility, right? Knowing that early on, and again, this is my own view of the situation, but you could probably talk about this as well, where early on, he's very much stepping into a role where he's somewhat secondary to Andy Reid, to a point now where I think if you look at this team, Brett Veach is kind of on par with Andy Reid now as far as the structure standpoint, having to navigate that in a deliberate and tactical way so as not to step on anybody's toes, but also have success. I think we I think the general public undersells how good of a job Brett Veach has done with the politics of that job. And in addition to how well he's done on the football field, selecting players and building that franchise.
Oh my God. If we're talking about politics in the NFL, we could talk all day over many beers or bottles of wine or tequila or whatever people do these days, because it's complicated. It's a little easier when you're younger and you have a senior level head coach like you do, Andy Reid, right? There's this unbelievable respect that you have. But I will say, Eric, that fades. It's easier in the first 2 or 3 years, right? When you start establishing yourself, and he has, for sure. I'm talking about Brett Veach being, again, at the top of his game right now and continuing to grow. Navigating, as I mentioned earlier. So it's easy to get along with the coach, the head coach, in my mind, someone as respected as Andy. His coaching staff, he's got a coordinator, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. I mean, Steve Spagnuolo is another great football mind. I really, really like Steve. I'm so happy that he's there and doing so well. I mean, to have I don't know where you are. You might have your thoughts about your new offensive coordinator there. I like him. I like him, and I think those are guys with a lot of experience. What I'm saying in the end, back to Brett Veach, for everyone to know this, is Brett is not worried about how he's perceived out there, and he still has an unbelievable, if that's the wrong word, he has a very, very significant amount of respect in the building in Kansas City at Arrowhead, where people aren't just going, it's all Andy, or it's all Spags, or you know, whoever it may be, right? Or it's the owner. They recognize his importance, his eye. I mean, he was the one. I remember reading about him being the one that projected, what's his name? What's his name? What's your running back's name?
Isaiah Pacheco.
Pacheco. He said that Pacheco was going to be 1,000-yard runner. I mean, I'm just saying he's a talented running back. He's got a talent. Point is, what I'm saying here is I think it's fascinating how he's worked through all of this, and I think the pastures are so green for him in the future.
Yeah, and Andy Reid does such a good job of giving his assistants. He does such a good job of giving everybody in that building a role where they can be successful. And he's never had a problem letting, people, succeed up and above him, right? You had Sean McDermott, you had obviously Nagy went and on, be a head coach. Doug Peterson won a Super Bowl before Andy Reid even won a Super Bowl, and on and on and on. And I think Veach, obviously, and when you look at who has come out of that building, obviously Mike Borgonzi, their assistant GM, is well regarded. Brand Tillis is interviewed for some GM jobs, and obviously Ryan Poles, who is is now a general manager as well. I think Veach is doing the same thing where he's kind of throwing the ladder back down so that the people that have helped build that championship team can also get some shine as well. And that, that's obviously something you've done in your career as well. Now that you watch Rand Carthon, one of your former scouts, be a GM, and guys all across the league that have had experience with you, it's cool to see, right? Because you do want that success. The league is better the more teams, have successful people and smart people in that chair.
It's so true, and I love seeing it. I love seeing how these guys are evolving, and the people that they're putting out from really good organizations. I think is great. I think it's great that Eric Bieniemy goes to Washington to do his thing, and you guys get back. I keep saying this. Kansas City gets back Matt Nagy, as I mentioned earlier. I mean. Yeah. Good people, very good football people who can win at a lot of levels. That's Kansas City. Do we talk about Detroit, or do you want to go somewhere else on this?
Well, I think when you look at Detroit, I want to talk about them because this is a different thing, right? Kansas City. I mean, when they let John Dorsey go, they were a successful franchise, 10-6. They were 12-4 in 2016, the year before they let Dorsey go. A totally different animal here. Kind of similar to your time in Atlanta, where this team was struggling, right? And, they had a couple, 2014, 16, and 17, they had winning records. Still wasn't good enough. They went ahead and went with Patricia and, Quinn, and that didn't work. And so they had to kind of build it up from the studs. But I look at what they're doing here. They hired a few like big data bowl people. K.O. Brignetti is one of my friends, and I think does a really good job there. They even hired one of my former interns to be on that staff as well. I think Detroit is they've had a clue in a lot of different places for a while, and they were just waiting for kind of the clean slate that they ended up getting with the Dan Campbell and with the Brad Holmes regime. Now they're not out of the woods, as we talked about earlier, but I do think there's a lot to like about how they're building this football team, and they have a lot of options now because unlike a lot of teams that have a quarterback like Jared Goff, the contract for Goff isn't particularly onerous for them in the future. So what I like about them is they've given themselves a lot of outs, but they also have a really clear path to success over the next few years, given that conference and where it's at.
Okay, well, staying on coaching for a minute and away from Brad, because I've talked about Brad Holmes way too much. Are you a fan from where you sit of a coaching staff that is highly represented by former players in the NFL? Do you think there's a line to be drawn there? I mean, I have some opinions about it, but they seem to have a real belief in it. It seems as though Carolina Panthers are doing some of that, correct? With how they're putting their staff together. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, I need to see the results. And like Dan Campbell, when you look at our Sumer model that talks about, fourth down decisions, how they use timeouts, all the stuff in game. Like Dan Campbell's not a meathead when it comes to those decisions. He goes for the right fourth downs. I think clock management is where maybe he's a little weaker, but on balance, Ben Johnson, the coordinator, is a son of two math teachers, right? A very sharp guy. Aaron Glenn was a fantastic corner in the NFL for the Texans and Jets, and I remember the other team he played for. I think there's a good balance there, and maybe it's just like, I think as long as the coach, who's kind of more of the CEO rah-rah guy, listens to the people who are telling him about the stuff that is sort of more mathematical, like which fourth downs to go to and stuff, I'm more than happy with that, it being him being kind of that person that can rile up a team. Because I do think it's a hard job to motivate professional players in some ways. Like, it's just not, we talked about Deion Sanders on Monday. It's a totally different job in the NFL. These are grown people who are, that's their livelihood. And I think Campbell has kind of split the difference pretty well. Now, to maybe draw back a little bit on my positivity is I'd like for them to start the season better. 2021, they started the season 0-10-1. Last year, they started 1-6. Very similar to Ron Rivera, another former player, right? Former Bears linebacker during the Super Bowl years. The Washington Commanders start every season slow. I'd like to see some of these guys who are kind of more that player type start the season more quickly. And I think it's maybe, you look at McVay, you look at Shanahan, every single year, week one, Andy Reid, they come out with some new schematic thing. When scheme isn't necessarily your forte and motivation is, maybe that leads to slower starts, and maybe you can motivate, older, tired players mid-season better than the McVays of the world. So I do see some drawbacks to it, but I think in the case of Campbell, I think he balances things pretty well. What do you think?
Oh, I think Dan Campbell does balance things well. I mean, he's got some, Dan was an overachiever in his own right, respectfully, as a hard-nosed, tough guy. When you talk to people that know Dan, they really like him at a lot of levels, right? And you can only imagine players wanting to follow him. Now, when you get other athletes that are in there who are top-notch athletes, and I think this is where a coach like Dan would have to be careful. I'm sure he chose, his players, his former players who are coaches now, Aaron Glenn, right? Gosh.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about Aaron Glenn as a player, I was about ready to say Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Glenn, he was a damn good football player. He worked hard. He was a tough ass. I mean, those are the guys you want, right? Even if they were the top of the heap. You obviously need to be careful about bringing someone in who has prima donna to them. If you have a prima donna coming in and they don't know necessarily how to push the buttons of some of these players that are, some of the midline good football players, and they don't relate to the guys who aren't at the top of the heap, then I think you run into a situation. And I only had always wondered, okay, I think there's a nice mix. And I think having football players, everyone has played for the most part. I'm just saying, like NFL stud players, you can have some as long as there's an understanding and as long as their work ethic's there, right? Some of those guys were so good that they could, they could slip around some of the work ethic things, just speaking in general.
Yeah. So, there's an example. I mean, Mike Singletary is a Hall of Fame player, one of the best players to ever play in the league. And yet there were and I'm not breaking, these are reports. Like, I'm not breaking any ground here. Like, when he was an assistant with the Vikings, like, he was not thought, like, he cut corners, let's just say that. And that was well documented. And that's exactly what you're going against, right? I think we at Sumer, like, we're trying to build a company. Like, we talk about this every single day about what people need to see in leadership, what they need to see in, you need to see your VP or your CEO, working hard, doing the extra things, right? Because that's the only way you're going to set a tone. Like, you can't teach talent for the most part, right? So if all that your players see is you just being uber talented and living off of that, that's not an inspirational thing. That's like me looking at LeBron James dunking a basketball and being like, man, I want to be that. Well, I can't be that because I'm not 6'8", 270 with a 50-inch vertical jump. If I see LeBron at the gym twice a day working out, I can that can motivate because I can still do that. And I think for a guy like Dan Campbell, I even think, look, I'm showing a little bit of my, tight end like bias here. I also think Mike Tice is like a very similar comp. And Mike Tice got an awful lot of that Vikings team when Red McCombs wasn't actually putting any money, towards the team. And I think that guys like that who work hard, who are humble, even if they're former players, I think it resonates with the players quite a bit.
It does. And Mike Tice, that's a good example of a guy who I love Mike too. I think Mike had so many positives to him, and he also knew his limitations. And I think that's good. And I guess that's what I'm saying. When a player who's a former player in the NFL, they're obviously excellent football players in the scope of it all. But when they have a really good understanding of what the shortcomings are and where their challenges are and where they benefit, they can see that in the players. Sometimes the star players have a hard time seeing it in their players. To your points on Mike Singletary and some of those players. Anyway, I was very curious in your thoughts about that. I know we wanted to cover a couple more topics before we cut off, but it's a good conversation.
I think it's really cool. Like I just said, I think it's cool that Dan Campbell's having success. I also think it's really cool that despite kind of like the memeing of him and kind of talking about him as a meathead, he's actually quite progressive as a coach. I like all those things. I like people who break the mold, and he certainly does. I think it's time to talk about our favorite games this weekend, Thomas. We were going through them together. This is a good week, man. You have Chargers, Fins. You have Jets, Bills, which I think will be a great game. Obviously, the game Thursday. What game are you the most looking forward to this coming weekend?
I'm looking forward to the Cowboys and the Giants. I mean, I know that's probably like, oh, okay, Thomas, of course you are. It's on Monday Night Football, etc. But again, I am really excited to see what Dallas does defensively, bringing in Gilmore. I was talking to my good friend Dan Quinn recently, and he's excited about that back seven, about how they can operate. They have added speed. They have talent there, of course. We all love Micah Parsons and what he can do. I just like what that defense can do and understanding how important that defense is going to be. And this is where I want to toss it to you as well. Toss it over and say, okay, well, then you have Dak Prescott. He's got to stop throwing interceptions. But as I mentioned recently, it's not only his fault. I mean, half of those balls that were dropped last year or intercepted could be laid on the receivers too, right? Yep. So the point is having a strong defense, thriving defense that I think Dan can take the defense to, Dan Quinn, to having an offense. What I don't agree is the worry about interceptions coming from Prescott and that they might, and Mike Double M might bring it back and be a little more conservative with the approach. I don't believe so, man. I think you got to go for it. You can't be worried and get real conservative with him because you think he's now just randomly tossing INTs. I know you need to control it. I get it. I think you need to play your game.
Yeah, I actually look, Matthew Stafford 2 years ago led the league in interceptions and won a Super Bowl. Phil Simms won a Super Bowl with throwing more than 20 interceptions. You look up and down the field. Like Peyton Manning had a lot of years with 14, 15 interceptions. Warren Moon threw a lot of interceptions. Like John Elway threw a lot of interceptions. I think interceptions interceptions can tell you some stuff. And to me, what it tells you is that Dak Prescott's going to throw the ball into high leverage places. And I think when you have talent like CeeDee Lamb, they bring over Brandon Cooks, who I know has been everywhere in the league, but has been productive kind of basically everywhere he's gone. Michael Gallup coming off the ACL. They brought that Ferguson from Wisconsin to play tight end. And then they got Pollard in the backfield, and on a great offensive line too. If I had those players, I'd make them drop the ball. I mean this, I would throw them passes in dangerous spots because I trust them. And they had some variance, they had some drops, they had some, and a lot of Dak's interceptions were at inopportune times, which is not really predictive. And so all this is to say, I think bringing in Cooks, opening up the middle of the field with his deep threat, I think that helps him a lot. I think Mike McCarthy's a little underrated as a coach. And even though I really think Kellen Moore is an upgrade for the Chargers, I think McCarthy will do a good enough job here. To your point about the defense, I mean, look at Malik Hooker's a great safety. Jaron Kearse is a great, they got players all up and down. this is a talented football team, and I'm really excited. I mean, I think that they're as good of an odds to win the NFC East as the Eagles are. I look at the other side, and again, when I think about this team, again, 9-7-1 last year, the Giants, kind of a point differential of more like a 7-10 team, right? So like got a good easy schedule going into the year. Their schedule is about a point easier per game on a neutral field than the average team. Brian Dable's credit, took advantage of it, made the playoffs, won a playoff game on the road. Very impressive effort against Minnesota. This season, they have one of the hardest schedules I've ever seen. They don't have a bye until like week 12 or 13. Like I think 8 of their first 13 games are on the road. Obviously playing a division with both Eagles and Cowboys. I think that when I talked about concern about, okay, if Detroit takes a step back here, I don't want them firing everybody. I have similar concerns about the Giants. I don't think that they'll reset if they have a bad year, but I have concerns because I think this is a team on the rise, and I think it's a team that'll get better this year, but I don't know if they'll have a better record, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head with it. I mean, it's a tough schedule to be playing, and I think it's a great game to kick them off with, right? Both of the teams. You know, I think where we are right now with the Giants, with their talent right now, I think they're, and their coaching. I mean, look, I think he won Coach of the Year, right? We're thinking about Brian Daboll I've just been really impressed with how that team has been pulling things together. And I'm also talking about Joe Shane and company as well, right? I think they're thought out. They have obviously a very good president and a long-standing president and owner of the team in John Mara, who is really good with that group right now. I think he really appreciates it. I think he's moved on from the idea of having those elder statesmen in that position. He's got 2 younger guys that I really think he likes dealing with. And, even though I'm a fan of what they've done in New York over the years at different spots, there have been some tough times, of course. I think they're rising above that there, and I think it's going to be fun to watch this game.
Yeah, and defensively, they patched together some of their weaknesses. Deonte Banks, I think, has some real potential at corner for them out of Maryland, one of the better corners in last year's draft. They got Thibodeau and Evan Neal. Now, there are some questions. Neal has not played all that well for the first year and change of his career, but we remember Andrew Thomas really struggled coming out of Georgia in 2020, and he's earned one of the best contracts in the history of the position. So that can improve. I'm excited for that game. The game I'm looking for is another division game, Thomas. Another one with a road team, in my opinion, should be favored, although they're not. And this is the Green Bay Packers going to Soldier Field to play the Bears. I don't know about you, but I look at the Packers, and it might just be because I used to teach at UWL and Brian Gutekunst was an alumni. It also could be just I'm a huge Matt LaFleur fan. I think Matt LaFleur has done really good things in Green Bay. I just think that the market is looking at Green Bay and not giving enough credit to the stability that they've been able to achieve when they're immediately dismissing them now that they have Jordan Love at quarterback.
Well, this is a big deal for them. You talk about crossroads. Yes, Matt LaFleur has done a really good job back to navigating. I know it's a key word today, navigating a first ballot Hall of Famer as a quarterback, navigating a lot of tough decisions. I mean, that's not easy to do. Can you imagine that? I mean, Matt comes into Green Bay with a little bit of question out there. Okay, he's coming in. How is he going to handle that? What is his presence going to be like with a guy with that much cachet? I'm talking about an Aaron Rodgers. And the Cat handled it very, very well. Now, positively, he's got a guy that he can push the buttons with a little bit more. Now it will be really interesting to see how Matt LaFleur has evolved as a leader, because now his shots are going to count. Not that they didn't before, and I say that respectfully, but now he's the guy steering it 100%. Not that he wasn't before. And it's going to be interesting to see that. No longer does Brian Gutekunst have to deal with, some of the nonsense that happened. This gives them an opportunity to be GM and head coach the way most of us had it, right? With some sort of the good, strong parts of it, and then the challenges of it. And you'll see how how these men deal with the challenges. And I think the odds are that they're going to handle it solidly to even better than solidly.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's funny because you had such a great quarterback, but he also, from what I could tell, provided almost no stress from the off the field, interpersonal stuff. And so to your point, like, it was probably you kind of had the best of both worlds in some ways, and then of course you made some big splashes, obviously the Julio Jones trade and everything. You got full credit for that, well deserved. I think with LaFleur, like, even when you look, so it's funny because like we post these numbers about like how much win probability of coach adds with decisions, and the Packers for the last, the LaFleur era have taken way too many timeouts before the 2-minute relative to other teams. And that dings LaFleur's rating. But most Packers fans would tell you, well, no, that's Aaron Rodgers waiting until the end of the shot clock and then calling timeout, And so even something like as silly as that, where he gets more autonomy about how the game is called, because he's the man now, right? Jordan Love is kind of secondary to him. I think is a good thing for him because it allows him to sort of break free in the same way that Mike McCarthy's going to break free this year in Dallas, breaking free from this idea that it was just a great quarterback that made his record pretty good. And I like that a lot. Moving briefly into Chicago, I don't really have that many bad things to say about what Ryan Poles has done. The only thing I will say, and Bears fans have been very, very optimistic this year. Mm-hmm. The only thing I'll say is I think it takes a little longer to rebuild than 1 year. And so they did a really good job of turning their draft picks into more draft picks this year and picking players that I think have a really good chance of having success. My worry is we're maybe just a year too early. I don't know necessarily if they're going to have a great pass rush. I don't know offensive line-wise if they're going to be as full there as they need to be. I think that this Chicago team is moving in the right direction. I just think maybe we're a year too early on them. And this is my statement for everything. I just hope expectations don't get in the way of Ryan Poles being able to do the job to his fullest extent.
Well, I think those are great comments. I don't think I can add a whole bunch more. I'm looking forward to seeing the game. To your point, you picked out a really good game to watch because, I mean, I can't get away from this. I really want to see where Fields is. I want to see how he continues to evolve. That's not rocket science here, but as a GM and as, Ryan being in that situation and the decision that they made to go with, stay there and stay in that mode when there was some banter the last year and a half or whatever, what to do. That's a big move, right? They're the big moves that GMs make in the development of the team that they're going to be judged on for years to come. And I love to see it. No one's rushed more, right? Did he have the most rushing yards this year or the most avoid? What's our sack avoidance?
Yeah, so Fields took more sacks as a percentage of dropbacks than any quarterback in the league, and he was a top 10 rate since people have been looking at the stats. So that to me is the one place where Fields really needs to improve. But he did rush for over 1,100 yards last year, which is the second best from what in the modern era by a quarterback. So you kind of got the good with the bad, right? You got a guy that's kind of needs to work on processing, needs to work on avoiding sacks, but when he avoids the sacks, he's as athletic as any quarterback that's in the NFL, and that includes Lamar Jackson. So yeah. It's a dichotomy for sure. And I think, to your point, I really want to see Fields develop. So far as a passer, it hasn't been pretty, but they haven't surrounded him with much. They bring in DJ Moore, Cole Kmet gets a contract, Darnell Mooney's now a 2. They got Chase Claypool from Pittsburgh. There's a chance there for sure, and I really want to see that.
There's a chance. I think what they did that way, I think was good for him. And let's put some tools around him, and see how he can thrive. So
for sure. And honorable mentions for this were Pittsburgh, San Francisco, Cleveland, Cincinnati. I think is going to be a great game as well. 2 of us used to live in Ohio, and then I'm a big fan of Buffalo, New York, and obviously Detroit, Kansas City. Like this week, and I actually think the loser of Chargers, Dolphins is going to struggle to make the playoffs, even in week 1, because the AFC is so many good teams, Thomas. We're in for a really fun, and even Carolina, Atlanta, to me, in that NFC South is a high leverage football game. So That's our cue, by the way. So if you're on the stream right now, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. Tell everybody about this show. Tell everybody about Stats and Schemes, our new podcast that goes on Tuesday by Sean and Tage. And then the Odd Man From podcast with Parker Fleming is going to be tomorrow. We'll be back next week on Monday. We'll tell you all about this weekend's games. Thank you all for showing up. Again, like I said, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, tell somebody about our show so that when we hit it big, you can be one of the first here. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been the SumerSports Show.